On April 5, 1933, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102, making private ownership of gold illegal in the United States, and this order gave American citizens exactly 1 month to turn in all their gold coins, gold bullion, and gold certificates to the Federal Reserve, or face 10 years in federal prison and a $10,000 fine. And this wasn't during wartime or to fight terrorism. This was during peacetime to allow unlimited money, printing, and after confiscating gold from citizens at $20.67 per ounce, the government immediately revalued gold to $35 per ounce and kept the 75% profit, destroying private wealth and concentrating it in government hands. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what FDR did on April 5, 1933, why he made gold ownership a federal crime punishable by 10 years in prison, how this confiscation represented the largest peacetime theft of private property in American history, and why this moment marked the beginning of unlimited government power over money and the end of sound money in America. Because once you understand that FDR didn't confiscate gold to save the economy, but to remove the constraint that prevented unlimited money printing, you'll understand why the dollar has lost 98% of its value since 1933, why inflation is permanent, why gold is still valuable while dollars are worth less every year, and why governments fear gold because they can't print it and can't control it. Before we explain what FDR did in April 1933, we need to understand what gold was and why the government wanted to confiscate it, because this reveals the real reason for the theft. In 1933, the United States was on the gold standard, which meant that paper dollars were backed by gold and could be exchanged for gold at a fixed rate. The official rate was $20.67 per ounce, and this meant that if you had a $20 gold certificate, you could take it to a Federal Reserve Bank and receive 1 ounce of gold, and this gold backing constrained the government's ability to print money, because if the government printed too many dollars, people would redeem those dollars for gold, and the government's gold reserves would be depleted. So the gold standard acted as a brake on inflation and prevented the government from expanding the money supply beyond what the gold reserves could support. During the Great Depression, which began in 1929, the government wanted to inflate the money supply to try to stimulate the economy. This was the Keynesian theory that printing money and spending it would create jobs and end the Depression. But the gold standard prevented this monetary expansion because there wasn't enough gold to back more dollars, and as long as citizens could own gold and redeem dollars for gold, the government couldn't print unlimited money. So FDR decided to remove this constraint, and the way he did it was to confiscate all privately owned gold, making it illegal for citizens to hold the one asset that protected them from inflation and that limited government power. And he did this under the pretense of emergency powers during the Depression, claiming it was necessary to save the economy, when actually it was necessary to allow unlimited money, printing that would benefit the government and banks while destroying the savings of ordinary Americans. Here's exactly what Executive Order 6102 said, and why the language reveals that this was a deliberate theft, not an emergency measure. The order was titled, quote, "Forbidding the hoarding of gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates within the continental United States," end quote. And notice the word hoarding. FDR framed private ownership of gold as hoarding, making it sound selfish and antisocial. When actually people owned gold to protect their savings from inflation, hoarding implies keeping something you don't need just to deprive others. But owning gold was rational self-protection, not hoarding. The order stated, quote, "All persons are hereby required to deliver on or before May 1, 1933, to a Federal Reserve Bank or branch or agency thereof, or to any member bank of the Federal Reserve System, all gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates, now owned by them," end quote. And this meant that every American had 26 days from April 5th to May 1st to turn in all their gold, and the penalty for not complying was stated clearly, quote, "Whoever willfully violates any provision of this executive order may be fined not more than $10,000, or if a natural person may be imprisoned for not more than 10 years or both," end quote. And $10,000 in 1933 was equivalent to about $200,000 today, and 10 years in federal prison was and is a serious felony sentence, comparable to sentences for armed robbery or kidnapping. So FDR was threatening Americans with armed robbery-level prison sentences for the crime of owning gold, and this reveals that the government viewed citizens who protected their wealth as criminals who needed to be imprisoned. Let me show you the exact numbers of how much gold was confiscated and how much profit the government made by immediately revaluing it after confiscation. And this proves that the order was theft, not economic necessity. The government required citizens to exchange their gold for dollars at the official rate of $20.67 per ounce, and approximately 300 tons of gold was turned in by private citizens, that's about 10 million ounces, and at $20.67 per ounce, the government paid citizens about $207 million for gold that was worth far more. Then, immediately after the confiscation deadline passed, in January 1934, Congress passed the Gold Reserve Act, which revalued gold from $20.67 to $35 per ounce, a 69% increase, and this meant that the gold the government had just confiscated from citizens at $20.67 was now officially worth $35, and the government made an instant profit of about $143 million, which is about $3 billion in today's money, by confiscating gold at the low price and revaluing it at the high price, and this profit went to the US Treasury to fund government spending, so the government literally stole wealth from citizens by forcing them to sell gold cheap and then immediately raising the price. And citizens had no recourse. They couldn't sue, they couldn't demand the difference. They'd been robbed at gunpoint by their own government with the threat of 10 years prison, and most people complied because the alternative was prison. What would you do if the government announced tomorrow that you have 30 days to turn in all your gold, silver, Bitcoin, or any other asset that holds value, and if you don't comply, you'll face 10 years in federal prison and a $200,000 fine, and after you turn in your assets for a government-set price, the government immediately increases the official value and keeps the profit? This is exactly what happened in 1933, and most Americans complied out of fear, but some resisted, and understanding their resistance shows that Americans knew this was theft, even at the time. If you're starting to understand that FDR's gold confiscation wasn't about saving the economy, but was about removing the constraint that prevented unlimited money printing, that the 10-year prison threat was designed to terrorize Americans into surrendering the one asset that protected them from inflation, and that the immediate revaluation after confiscation proves this was planned theft, not emergency policy, then stay with me, because what comes next will show you who resisted the confiscation, what happened to them, why the confiscation enabled 70 years of inflation, and why gold ownership was illegal in America until 1974. Subscribe now, because very few channels will explain how FDR's gold confiscation destroyed sound money in America and began the era of unlimited government power over currency. And understanding this is essential to knowing why gold is still valuable while dollars lose value every year. Here's what happened to Americans who refused to comply with the gold confiscation order, and the few cases that were prosecuted reveal that the government was serious about the 10-year prison threat. Most Americans complied with the order out of fear. The combination of the 10-year prison sentence and $10,000 fine was enough to convince most people to turn in their gold. But some people refused, and the most famous case was Frederick Barber Campbell, who was a lawyer and who challenged the constitutionality of the executive order. Campbell argued that the president didn't have the authority to confiscate private property without compensation, that gold ownership was a property right protected by the Fifth Amendment, and that the executive order was unconstitutional because it wasn't authorized by Congress. But the courts ruled against Campbell. The Supreme Court upheld the gold confiscation in the case Norman versus Baltimore and Ohio Railroad in 1935, ruling that Congress had the power to regulate currency even if that meant abrogating gold clauses in contracts, and this meant that the government could change the value of money retroactively, breaking promises that had been made in gold. And Campbell was convicted of violating the executive order, though his sentence was light because of his legal challenge. But the precedent was set. The government could confiscate gold and threaten citizens with prison, and the courts would uphold it. Other Americans who kept gold in safety deposit boxes or hid it in their homes were generally not prosecuted unless they tried to sell it or were caught in audits, and over time many Americans simply kept their gold hidden and passed it down to descendants. And in 1974, when gold ownership was relegalized, many families still had gold that had been hidden since 1933, and this gold had increased in value from $35 per ounce in 1934 to over $100 per ounce in 1974, proving that gold holds value while dollars lose value over time. Here's exactly why FDR confiscated gold and why the official reasons given were lies designed to hide the real motive, because understanding this reveals how governments operate. The official reason given in Executive Order 6102 was that gold hoarding was preventing economic recovery during the Great Depression. The theory was that people were hoarding gold instead of spending money, and this reduced the money supply and deepened the depression. So by forcing people to turn in gold and receive dollars, the government would increase the money in circulation and stimulate the economy. But this explanation makes no sense for several reasons. First, most Americans didn't own significant amounts of gold. The vast majority of Americans were poor during the Depression and had no gold to hoard. The people who owned gold were the wealthy and banks, so confiscating gold from the rich wouldn't help the poor. Second, the government could have achieved the same goal by simply devaluing the dollar relative to gold without confiscating gold from citizens. They could have changed the official price from $20.67 to $35 per ounce and let citizens keep their gold, but they didn't. They insisted on confiscating it, which reveals that the real motive wasn't stimulus but control. Third, the immediate revaluation after confiscation proves that the government wanted the gold not to help the economy, but to profit from the revaluation. If the goal was stimulus, why take the gold first and then raise the price? Why not just raise the price and let everyone benefit? The real reason for the confiscation was to remove the constraint on money printing, as long as citizens could own gold and redeem dollars for gold. The government couldn't print unlimited dollars, but once gold was confiscated and gold ownership was illegal, the government could print as many dollars as it wanted because citizens had no way to convert those dollars into anything real. And this is exactly what happened. After 1933, the money supply increased dramatically. The government printed money to fund the New Deal, World War II, and every program since, and the dollar lost 98% of its value because there was no gold backing to constrain the printing. Let me show you the specific economic data that proves gold confiscation enabled inflation and destroyed the dollar's value over the next 90 years. In 1933, when FDR confiscated gold, the consumer price index was 13.7. Today, the CPI is 307. That's a 22-fold increase in prices, meaning what cost $1 in 1933 costs $22 today. And this is a 95.5% loss in purchasing power, nearly the same as the 98% loss since 1971 when Nixon closed the gold window, and the pattern is clear. When gold backs the dollar, inflation is low or zero. When gold is confiscated or the gold link is broken, inflation becomes permanent. From 1790 to 1933, 143 years under the gold standard, prices in America increased only about 50% total, meaning average annual inflation was about 0.3%, almost zero, and there were long periods of deflation where prices actually fell, and this price stability allowed people to save money and know it would hold value. But from 1933 to today, 92 years since FDR confiscated gold, prices increased 22-fold, meaning average annual inflation was 3.4%. And if you use the original CPI methodology before the government changed the calculation to hide inflation, real inflation has been closer to 6 to 8% per year, which would mean prices increased not 22-fold, but closer to 100-fold. And this inflation is the direct result of removing gold backing through confiscation, because without gold to constrain money printing, the government can create unlimited dollars, and more dollars chasing the same goods means higher prices. And this inflation is a hidden tax that steals from savers and benefits the government and banks who create money. Here's how the gold confiscation changed America from a nation of sound money to a nation of fiat currency and permanent inflation, and why this shift destroyed the middle class. Before 1933, Americans could protect their savings by holding gold. If you saved $100 in 1920 and held it as gold at $20.67 per ounce, you'd have about 4.8 ounces of gold. And if you held that gold from 1920 to 1974, when gold ownership was relegalized, that gold would be worth about $480 at $100 per ounce in 1974, a 4.8 times return, whereas if you held that $100 in cash from 1920 to 1974, it would buy only about 1/5 as much due to inflation, so gold preserved wealth while cash lost value. And this is why the government hated private gold ownership, because gold allowed citizens to opt out of inflation. But after 1933, when gold ownership was illegal, Americans had no way to protect their savings from inflation. They could hold cash which lost value, or they could buy stocks and real estate which required capital and risk and favored the wealthy. So the confiscation forced ordinary Americans into a system where their savings were guaranteed to lose value, and this destroyed the incentive to save and encourage debt. And this shift from a saving culture to a debt culture has been disastrous for the middle class. Before 1933, Americans saved about 10% of their income and had little debt. Today, Americans save almost nothing and have record debt, and this is the direct result of inflation caused by removing gold backing through confiscation. Here are the legal and constitutional arguments about whether FDR had the authority to confiscate gold and why the court's approval of the confiscation set a dangerous precedent for unlimited government power. The Fifth Amendment to the Constitution states that private property shall not, quote, be taken for public use without just compensation, end quote, and gold coins were private property, so confiscating them should have required just compensation, but the government claimed that paying $20.67 per ounce was just compensation, even though the government immediately revalued gold to $35, so citizens received less than fair market value, which violates the Fifth Amendment. Additionally, the executive order was issued by the president without congressional approval. FDR claimed authority under the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917, which gave the president power to regulate gold transactions during wartime. But 1933 was not wartime. The U.S. was not at war, so using a Wartime Emergency Act during peacetime was a stretch of executive authority, and critics at the time argued this was unconstitutional. But Congress later ratified the action by passing the Gold Reserve Act in 1934, which gave retroactive approval, so the confiscation stood. The Supreme Court upheld the confiscation in Norman v. Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, ruling that Congress has broad power to regulate currency under the Constitution's power to coin money and regulate its value, and the court said that gold clauses in contracts which promised payment in gold could be nullified by Congress, which meant the government could rewrite contracts retroactively and devalue the currency people expected to receive, and this precedent has been used ever since to justify government power over money, and it's why the government can print unlimited dollars, change the value of currency, break promises about social security and pensions, and claim it's all constitutional. And the gold confiscation was the first time this power was used so brazenly, threatening citizens with prison for owning property, and the courts approved it, setting the precedent that the government's power over money is absolute, and citizens have no recourse. Let me show you what happened after the confiscation, and how it enabled the monetary policies that created the inflation we're experiencing today. After confiscating gold in 1933, the government had removed the main constraint on money printing, and the results were immediate. The money supply M1 increased from 46 billion in 1933 to 99 billion by 1945, more than doubling in 12 years. And this expansion funded the New Deal programs that FDR wanted. It funded Social Security, the Works Progress Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and dozens of other programs. And none of this would have been possible under the gold standard, because there wasn't enough gold to back that much currency expansion. But with gold confiscated, the government could print freely. Then, in 1941, when the US entered World War II, the government printed even more money to fund the war. The federal debt increased from 43 billion in 1940 to 259 billion in 1945, a six-fold increase in 5 years. And this was financed by printing money, selling bonds to the Federal Reserve, which paid for them with printed money. And again, this massive monetary expansion would have been impossible under a gold standard because it would have depleted gold reserves. But with gold confiscated and private ownership illegal, the government had no constraint, and this pattern has continued ever since. Every war, every crisis, every program has been funded by printing money, And the result is that the dollar has lost 95% of its value since 1933, and gold has increased from $20.67 to over $2,700 today, a 130-fold increase, proving that gold holds value, while fiat currency created through confiscation loses value. Here's why gold ownership remained illegal in America for 41 years after the confiscation, and what changed in 1974 to make it legal again. After confiscating gold in 1933, the government kept gold ownership illegal for American citizens for 4 decades, and the reason was to maintain control over the currency. As long as citizens couldn't own gold, they couldn't opt out of dollar inflation. They had to accept whatever value the government assigned to the dollar, and they had to save and transact in dollars even as those dollars lost purchasing power. And this benefited the government, which could print money to fund programs, and it benefited banks, which could create money through lending. But it hurt savers whose dollars bought less every year, and it hurt workers whose wages didn't keep up with inflation. In 1974, after Nixon closed the gold window in 1971 and ended even the international gold standard, Congress passed legislation allowing Americans to own gold again starting January 1, 1975, and the reason they relegalized gold ownership was that with the dollar completely disconnected from gold internationally, the government no longer feared that Americans owning gold would threaten dollar stability. Americans could own gold, but they couldn't redeem dollars for gold from the government, so private gold ownership was allowed as a commodity investment, but not as a competing currency. And this is still the case today. You can own gold, but you can't use it as money. All transactions must be in dollars, and gold is taxed as a collectible at 28% when you sell it, which is higher than the long-term capital gains rate, so the government still discourages gold ownership through tax policy, and the fact that gold has increased from $35 per ounce in 1974 to over $2,700 today proves that gold is superior money to dollars, because if dollars were sound, gold wouldn't appreciate in dollar terms. It would stay stable. But dollars are unsound. They're constantly losing value through inflation. So gold appreciates as dollars depreciate, and this validates what Americans knew in 1933, that gold protects wealth and dollars destroy it, which is exactly why FDR confiscated gold. Here are the arguments defenders make for why FDR's gold confiscation was necessary and justified, and why every argument is either false or irrelevant. They claim the confiscation was necessary to fight the Great Depression and restore economic growth, but the Depression didn't end until World War II in the early 1940s, almost a decade after the confiscation, so the confiscation didn't work as stimulus. And the Depression ended because of war production, not because of monetary policy, so the economic justification is false. They claim that private gold ownership was preventing monetary expansion needed to help the poor, but as we showed, most poor people didn't own gold, the wealthy owned gold, so confiscating it didn't help the poor directly, and the monetary expansion that followed caused inflation that hurt the poor most, because they spend the highest percentage of income on necessities whose prices rose, so the claim that it helped the poor is backwards. They claim that FDR had legal authority under the Trading with the Enemy Act and Congress ratified it, so it was constitutional, but legality is not the same as morality or justice. The Fugitive Slave Act was legal. Japanese internment was legal. Many injustices have been legal. So pointing to legal authority doesn't justify confiscation, and the fact that the government threatened 10 years prison for owning gold shows this was tyranny, not legitimate law. They claim that no one was actually prosecuted and imprisoned for owning gold, so the 10-year threat was just a deterrent. But this is false. Multiple people were prosecuted, and the threat itself was a form of violence. Just because the government didn't imprison everyone who violated the order doesn't make the threat acceptable. And the fact that millions of Americans surrendered their gold out of fear shows the threat was effective coercion, which is the point. The final lesson of the 1933 gold confiscation is that governments fear gold because gold limits government power, and whenever government power expands, sound money is the first casualty. Gold is the opposite of fiat currency. Gold can't be printed. It's scarce. It holds value over centuries. It exists independent of government, and these properties make it sound money. But these same properties make it a threat to government power, because if citizens can hold wealth in gold, The government can't inflate away that wealth through money printing, and the government can't fund wars and programs by printing money if citizens can opt out by holding gold, so governments throughout history have attacked gold, sometimes by confiscating it like FDR did, sometimes by making it illegal to use as money, sometimes by manipulating the price, and always by promoting fiat currency that governments control. And the pattern is clear: sound money limits government, fiat money enables government, and citizens who understand this hold gold to protect themselves from government theft through inflation. And this is why gold has value. Not because it's useful as a commodity. Gold has limited industrial use. Its value comes from being money that governments can't print and can't control, and the fact that governments from FDR to Nixon to modern central banks have worked to eliminate gold from the monetary system proves that gold works. It protects citizens from government, which is exactly what government fears. Now you understand exactly what FDR did on April 5, 1933, when he signed Executive Order 6102, making gold ownership illegal and threatening 10 years prison for possession. He confiscated approximately 300 tons of gold from American citizens at $20.67 per ounce and immediately revalued it to $35, making an instant profit of over $140 million for the government, while citizens lost wealth. And you understand that this confiscation wasn't about fighting the Great Depression, but was about removing the constraint on money printing so the government could expand the money supply and fund programs without being limited by gold reserves. And you understand that the 10-year prison threat was necessary to terrorize Americans into compliance, because most people knew this was theft and wouldn't have surrendered their gold voluntarily. And you understand that gold ownership remained illegal for 41 years until 1975, because the government wanted to prevent Americans from opting out of dollar inflation. And you understand that since the confiscation in 1933, the dollar has lost 95% of its purchasing power, while gold has increased 130-fold from $20.67 to $2,700, proving that gold holds value while government fiat currency loses value through inflation. And you understand that FDR's confiscation set the precedent that government power over money is absolute, and citizens have no property rights when government declares an emergency. And this precedent has been used ever since to justify monetary expansion, currency devaluation, and inflation that transfers wealth from savers to government. If this explanation of how FDR confiscated gold in 1933 and threatened citizens with 10 years prison for owning it has made you understand that governments fear gold because gold limits their power to print money and inflate away debt, that the confiscation enabled 90 years of inflation that destroyed the dollar's value and your purchasing power, and that holding gold is an act of resistance against government theft through monetary expansion, then you need to see what we reveal next, because FDR's gold confiscation is just one event in a pattern of monetary betrayals. Subscribe now and prepare to discover how Nixon closed the gold window in 1971 and destroyed your savings through permanent inflation, how the crime of 1873 demonetized silver and betrayed the people, how the Federal Reserve created $9 trillion from nothing and gave it to Wall Street while you got nothing, and how every monetary crisis follows the same pattern. Government removes sound money, prints fiat currency, creates inflation, transfers wealth from the middle class to banks and government, and threatens anyone who resists with prison or penalties, because once you understand that, monetary history is a history of government stealing from citizens through inflation, and that gold confiscation in 1933 was the moment when America abandoned sound money forever. You'll understand why gold is still valuable, why dollars are worthless, why inflation never stops, why your savings lose value every year, why your children will be poorer than you, and why the only protection is to hold assets that governments can't print and can't confiscate, because the theft that began in 1933 continues today. The government still prints unlimited money. Inflation still destroys purchasing power, and the only difference is that now, instead of confiscating gold, they confiscate value through inflation, which is slower but just as effective at transferring wealth from you to government.